Welcome Lights Out family to another episode of After Dark with KK. As we get into the SG60 National Day mood, let KK go into some true Singapore ghost stories shared by Redditors. Singapore is an island of landmass approximately 735.7 square kilometers and should be classified as one of the countries with the highest death per square meter landmass. While the island's history was not filled with bloodshed, we had records of piracy in the 18th century, the affluence of Chinese triads when migration began, the 1915 Seapoint Mutiny, the Japanese Imperial Army occupation during World War II with the infamous Sokchin executions, as well as the race riots in 1964. Singapore, with its strategic location as a shipping port and a trading route, also became a metropolitan city as we knew today. And it became a melting pot of local folklores stemmed from neighbouring countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, superstitious practices from East and South Asia, not forgetting black magics and spells from countries like Thailand. Almost everyone in Singapore will have a ghost story or two to share, whether inflicted on themselves or someone they knew. I will share a handful of such ghost stories, beginning with the strange occurrences a successful and pious businesswoman had experienced in her own home. Auntie Margaret was the pride and joy in her family, a self-made businesswoman who made a fortune in electronics during the halcyon days of the 1980s. She managed to accrue enough money for a comfortable retirement and bought a 3-story high bungalow when property prices were not that outrageous. The sacrifices she made from building her business in her youth was not able to form a family of her own. Yet, she found solace and peace living in her spacious abode with a domestic helper and a pet Labrador. Margaret is also a pious Buddhist and religiously done her prayers and chanting twice daily in the prayer hall she had set up. This was where she had a large altar where she had housed the ancestral tablet as well as that of her deceased parents. The prayer hall would face the front entrance of her house and she felt it brought peace and protection to her house. Her dog was trained not to meddle with the ornated altar, and the 6-year-old canine would steer clear when he was playing his toys. Auntie Margaret would bring the dog for his highly anticipated daily walk after sunset when it was cooler. This particular evening, when Margaret and her large Labrador were preparing for their evening walk, the dog would suddenly freeze at the front door and started growling at the front yard with his sight dead straight at the gate. No matter how hard Margaret tried to nudge the big dog, he refused to move and kept growling. About a minute or so had passed. Doggy suddenly jumped and whimpered before scurrying to below the altar, a place he was forbidden to go near, yet he was whimpering and visibly trembling while taking refuge in a small crevice under the altar. The behaviour of the dog certainly took Aunt Margaret by surprise before something dawned on her that it was the first day of the lunar 7th month. She took a strong whiff of the air and it was indeed filled with burnt joss papers from the neighbourhood. Margaret composed herself and changed her plan for the walk, and walked towards the altar and started chanting a mantra with her religious beads. And when she was done, she gave the brass bowl a firm strike. She then uttered to herself,
"You guys leave me and my family alone."
The Labrador would shake out of his petrified state, but looked visibly fatigued and turned in for the night. For a period of time, there had been a spat of wild otters invading houses and started feasting on pet fishes, much to the distraught of owners. Aunt Margaret was receptive to this invasive force from nature, and through a vendor, she managed to rig up her place with motion sensing cameras which would give her live updates of movement at various corners in the house, while she had installed wire mesh for her front gate to protect her koi pond from being visited by these otters. There were some blind spots around the premise of her house. One late evening, Margaret and her dog were relaxing in the guest room that was just beside the altar. Suddenly, her phone lit up, stating that there was a movement detected in the kitchen. No biggie, she thought to herself. That could be her helper coming out from her own room for a drink. Instinctively, she listened for movement, but there was none. Immediately, her phone lit up again, this time signaling movement in the dining room. From where she was, she could look out the door to the dining and living room, but she saw nobody there. The phone lit up again, this time stating movement in the living room. For over an hour, Margaret said her phone kept lighting up with notifications that there were movements alternating between the dining and living rooms, yet she couldn't see or hear anything. At first, she thought that maybe otters had got in, but it wouldn't make sense since none of the cameras outside the house was activated. Margaret was beyond spooked and decided to sleep in the guest room for the rest of the night. The next day, she braced herself to review the footages captured from the various cameras the previous evening. To her amazement, the cameras captured two orbs, one bigger than the other, dancing around the dining and living room. They were perfectly spherical and weren't flitting around randomly like bugs would. Instead, it felt like the orbs were dancing around two areas in particular. One was at the altar in the dining room, and the other was at the corner of the living room, where Aunt Margaret had her late mother's walker parked. This visual actually brought Aunt Margaret out from fear, and she actually felt a warm respite as she started to have the thoughts that it was her deceased parents that had returned to pay her a visit that night. This happened during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My friend and I did an apartment viewing on Purvis Street. The apartment was located at the back part of a shop house that had been partitioned. The front part was occupied by a restaurant. The entrance to the apartment was located at the back alley where people would park their motorcycles or cars. I had arrived earlier than my friend at around 8 PM. Right from the moment I stepped into the alley, I had this eerie feeling all over me. The vibe of this alley was gloomy and stood in contrast to the lively Purvis Street just parallel to it. After I met up with the agent, we went up to the apartment itself, which was located on the 4th floor. The monthly rental fee was what really attracted me to this apartment. It was located in a prime location, yet way below the standard market price. The moment we stepped into the studio apartment, the agent would switch on the lights. You know how when you switch on the lights sometime, they will flicker for a couple of seconds before it actually turned on in that split second? I thought I saw a silhouette of a woman near the window pane. But when the lights had stabilized, there was no one there. At a moment, I felt like my mind was playing a trick on me, so I didn't say anything. In any case, my first impression of the apartment was that I felt unwelcome in it. The apartment unit reeked of a stench typical of a damp old room, and there was this overpowering sense of gloom inside. I felt suffocated, so I had to take off the mask, which was regimental to put on during this period, and place it on the corner desk in the living room. I would then walk around the apartment unit to take some pictures. The agent told me the previous tenant was a single European guy who had to break his lease prematurely because of some illness and went back to his country of origin. This would contradict with what I found throughout the apartment unit. There were strands of long black hair that can be spotted all around the vicinity, which I thought to myself could not belong to the previous tenant. Once again, I brushed it off, thinking the hair could belong to a local girlfriend. I felt especially disturbed by the amount of hair strands that can be found on the window grille at one of the windows. This particular window overlooked the aforementioned dark alley and was slightly ajar. About 15 minutes later, my friend finally arrived. There was this look of discomfort hanging from his face. Without looking much at the apartment, he beckoned me to leave the place. When I wanted to rewear my mask, guess what I found? There were strands of the same long black hair that stuck on my mask. At this juncture, I felt totally creeped out. There is no logical explanation as to how these hairs could have been there, as there was no wind and neither the agent nor myself had such long hair. Fortunately, I had a spare mask with me, so I threw away that icky mask. I would thank the agent and told him I would update him if I was interested. As we were safely ushered away from the building and approaching the lively Bugis Junction, my friend would tell me what he had seen while walking towards the building. I knew about the fact that he has the ability to see those kind of things, but he usually stayed cool and keep these things to himself. But what he told me next truly freaked me out.
As I was turning into the dark alley, something caught my attention immediately. From the apartment unit you were viewing on the 4th level, I saw a woman with scruffy long black hair started climbing out of the window facing the alley. Then, like Spider-Man, she started scaling the wall towards the end of the alley and disappeared at a bend with uncanny speed. By now, you should know what I have seen. Don't need for me to spell things out for you. Now you know why the rental fee was so low.
He would advise us to spend more time in the bright Bugis Junction to dissipate away any negative energy that might have followed us. Later that night, when I reviewed the pictures I've took, all of them turned out to be blurry. The one picture I've taken of the ajar window had those weird dark blots all over. These pictures gave me the creeps, so I deleted away immediately. The first story told the classic tale of animals being more sensitive to the supernatural, and the power of being religious worked a splendor. The second story was an archetypal one about the red herring of a rental unit with a price too good to be true. There will always be a catch. Up next, we have a story of a kid being a kid. Growing up in the 1980s to the 1990s, the void decks of the HDB flats were a playground for many, but it also posed a lot of dangers, usually physical, at times a run-in with the law enforcement, but one would never imagine a paranormal element was waiting in the corner. It was the 1990s. I was barely 12 years old. All I could remember was having the best time of my life, cycling around the neighborhood, creating a ruckus for every adult in the vicinity. My mother was like a default community leader and knew almost everyone, and on this particular evening, she had attended a wake of someone from a few blocks away from our house. She told me to accompany her despite my utmost reluctance.
If you insist I'm going to cycle there on my own.
I negotiated with her and she compromised. Just reminded me not to stray off too far from the block where the wake was held. I knew that I could go for a joyride on my bike and make it in time to reconvene with mom at the wake, so I sped off on my BMX bike. It was already 9:30 in the evening and there weren't many people wandering around the neighborhood by this point. Eventually, I reached a block of flat which was a stone throw away from the wake. The fluorescent lamp at one part of the void deck was flickering and in need of a change urgently. There was this old school circular bench covered with small blue and white squarish tiles, and the tabletop were made in the pattern of a chessboard. On the bench sat a frail and wrinkled old man puffing his cigarette. This was still the time when public smoking was not banned. I paid no attention to the old man, just paddling away on the walkway. The constant flickering of the lamp also made it hard to look at him. That very moment when I was perpendicular to the bench, the lamp suddenly stopped flickering, and what I saw was the old man looking very pale, grinning at me. The grin would haunt me for the longest time, even now when I'm recalling it. I sped off, not daring to turn my head around to see if the old man would be following me. When I reached the wake, the cacophony of adults talking and chanting from the priest calmed me down quite a bit. Then I felt the familiar pinch on my arm before hearing my mother asking me why was I so late. She had already reached there 10 minutes ago. I was dumbfounded as I knew I was cycling fast enough to make it there before my mother, yet time had transcended unexpectedly. When we went ahead to give our regards to the deceased, in the form of the incense burning and the customary bow, I got freaked out. The photograph on the altar was the old man who grinned at me just now. I developed a high fever the next day, and when I told my mother about the old man, she thought I was spewing nonsense until my aunt told her to bring me to consult a medium who told her it was the truth in what I had said. From that day onwards, my mother would not ask me to attend a wake or funeral on a whim. This happened in the early days of this particular southwestern-based MRT train station, which was just inaugurated. It was the early 1990s, and there would be 2 staff members assigned to lock up and stay over and tend to the station after the last train. My brother-in-law was assigned as a station master for SMRT back then and was handed such overnight assignment pretty regularly. There was nothing much to do except for some routine check before the station was open for the first train the next day. Therefore, duty personnel would tend to find a place to catch a wing. My brother-in-law's favourite spot would be those benches on the train platform, which was breezy, especially the surrounding was still filled with natural vegetation back then. During one night shift, he would do the usual to rest on his favourite platform bench. As the lights stayed on, he had to cover his face with newspaper to get himself into the mood to sleep. It would be barely an hour in, and he was woken up by a childlike giggling, emanating from somewhere on the platform. He tried to ignore it, although he had heard of some tales about the location the station was built upon. The giggling would continue and came from every direction, and by this point, my brother-in-law was trembling and was chanting religious verses under his breath. Then something happened that made him run down from the platform. As he was barefoot while lying on the bench, he could feel someone tickling the sole of his right foot. The moment he shot up, removing the newspaper covering his face, he heard the following coming from his rear.
Eh, Jajeka lah,
which translated to English, it meant,
Oh, it's a guy.
in Malay, the word jejeka is seldom used now and is considered to be old Malay vocab and was popular before the 1980s. My brother-in-law quickly wore his safety boots and sped down the stairs to seek refuge with his shift partner, revealing what he had encountered. From that night on, he did not dare to sleep on the platform no more. Has anyone heard of a scary story from MRT stations? The most famous definitely will be the headless passenger boarding the last train in Bishan Station. Of course, where Bishan Station was built, it was a famous graveyard. So we might be anticipating stories from the likes of Woodley Station, which was within the vicinity of the former Bidadari Cemetery. Now we have a couple of short stories shared by Nurse Anonymous, or simply Nurse A. Working in a relatively newer hospital in the northeastern end of the island, Nurse A thought there would be less opportunity for her to have a supernatural encounter. She had a mindset change very quickly when she started working there. These are her encounters.
One evening, I was serving midnight antibiotics in the male ward C, which has 6 beds. It made sense for me to serve the first patient on the left of the entrance, then work my way down, turn clockwise, and cater to the first patient on the right at the end. As it was about 3 a.m. in the morning, we kept the lights off, but I have a system to ensure the right antibiotics were administered to the right patient in complete darkness. The first patient, a 70-year-old Chinese man, was expected to be in deep slumber but was prompt to wake up for his pills. This was followed by a 50-year-old Malay man who was a bit more reluctant to be woken up for his medication. As a practice, I will pull the blinds of each bed to ensure the patients have a conducive environment to sleep after medication. As I was pushing the trolley towards the final bed on the left side of the room, I heard a low, male voice bellowing, "Missy." It sounded a bit demanding and with frustration, but we are dealing with patients who are constantly in pain. Therefore, I'm used to such tone from the patients. Instinctively, I turned around, wondering if he was either of the last 2 patients I had woken up, who would be asking for help to go to the toilet. I retraced my steps, but both beds had their blinds drawn, and I could even hear snoring from the Malay man, so I was sure it could not be either of them. I then walked around the ward to check if anyone else required help, but similarly, no one was awake. I then realized the voice had emanated from the center of the ward, the path that I will walk, and I was instantly spooked. I was crying for help within, but I remained calm to finish the antibiotics run for the rest of the patients in the ward, before promptly scurrying out of the room. From that day onwards, I would have a chill whenever I walked into that ward, be it day or night, but I would never hear the bellowing voice again. The second incident was even creepier when I think about it. It was after sunset one evening, and one patient needed an extra towel. However, the linen trolley had run out of spare clean towels. I then remembered that there was an empty ward, which had stocked up with fresh towels and other amenities for the next patient. So I thought of just taking one from there and replace it eventually. As it was just before 7 p.m, when I entered the ward, it was not totally dark, so I felt there was no need to turn on the light. Naturally, I will walk towards the bedside cupboard, where the fresh towels had been kept in. I did not really scan the room when I was inside. I was just aware of the empty bed and the neatly folded clean linen. When I knelt down to retrieve the towel from the lower cupboard, from my peripheral vision, I noticed a person standing beside me. It was instantaneous with the approach of this stranger just when I was at the bedside cupboard. I assumed it was the relative of an incoming patient, which, now thinking about it, was not the standard operating procedures to allow visitors to a ward before a patient was admitted. I just said, "Excuse me," to the stranger and made my way to the door with a clean towel in hand. I did not have a good look at the person, but I was certain I did not hear any footsteps or movement at a point of time when a stranger appeared. As I was in a hurry to pass the towel to the patient, I did not have time to dwell on the strange occurrence in the empty ward. I started thinking about it later that evening and went back to the ward to check if any patient had been admitted, but it remained empty until a couple of days later. So who was the person I saw that night? Was it a human being or something else?
I have been wanting to do an episode of After Dark solely on scary tales from hospital from the region. If you have any to share, feel free to contact me. I will be grateful for your contributions. The Old Changi Hospital is a well-known haunted locality in Singapore, which had been closed since 1997, so most of the stories we've heard were from explorations before it was locked up for development of late. Alexandra Hospital, built by the British in 1938, was a site for massacre during the Second World War, and it is still in operation. I had heard of certain locations within the premise were well-known hotspots for haunting. Being a small island with very few natural landscapes of interest for rest and recreation, renting a chalet to hang out for a barbecue cookout was a common activity young people or big extended family would indulge in for birthday or other types of celebratory occasions. There were some eastern-based chalets that were well known to be haunted hotspots. Even just wandering around the vicinity of these chalets at night can give one the creeps. We shall end tonight's episode with two strange stories of the paranormal kind from such chalet stays. I was at the chalet at Downtown East with a group of friends back in 2006 before it became the resort. Right across our chalet unit, we could access the swimming pool. One night, after the pool had closed, we thought it would be fun to sneak in. The gate was locked, but it was not too high, so we climbed over it. I remember feeling a bit uneasy the moment we reached the pool, but we went ahead anyway. We made our way up the stairs to the pool. It was completely dark, with no lights and not a single soul around. One of my friends leaned over to check the water temperature and dipped his hand in. As he did, he suddenly felt something tugging at him from the water. He had to struggle to keep his balance. Fortunately, two of us got hold of him before he really fell into the dark abyss of the pool. From that moment on, we all sensed that something wasn't right. Without saying anything to each other, we bolted off from the pool in a panic. Oddly enough, the gate we have climbed over is now unlocked. We just opened it and ran straight back to the chalet. Back in the chalet, the air felt unusually chilly. One of our older friends ended up burning an incense stick, maybe to calm whatever we might have disturbed. The last I heard, that pool does not exist anymore. This happened during my secondary school days when staying in the chalet with the extended family was a common occurrence, and we kids loved it every single time. Once, one of the older cousins came up with a good idea of going an adventure, which meant ghost hunting in the middle of the night. Without informing the adults, we sneaked off and ventured into the Pasir Ris Mangrove Boardway at around 1 AM, each with a torchlight, and trekked into the darkness. It wasn't an eventful walk, apart from some weird noises or shadows, which honestly could be the tricks of the mind, until we reached the infamous bird watching tower and started climbing it. I was at the rear with another cousin of mine, and as we were ascending, at the corner of my eye, I saw a white figure flash past really quickly at the base of the stairs. Feeling frightened, I tried to seek out confirmation of what I had seen. I turned to my cousin, who only raised his finger on his lips and pointed upwards. After the whole group of us reached the top of the watchtower, the group would start fooling around and scaring each other. My cousin at the rear would whisper to me, saying,
Don't talk about it here. Do it after we leave this place.
I was not the superstitious type, but I got the gist that talking about them would probably make them more fascinated and follow us, so I kept mum as we eventually exited the Broadway. When we had all returned to the chalet, my cousin would say that he saw the same thing I did. Since he is sensitive to these kind of things, as the group was mingling on the top of the tower, he noticed the same white figure standing very still at the bottom via his peripheral vision, seemingly just staring at us. I asked whether he had followed us as we left the Broadway. He said fortunately no, but he did spotted the white figure on the trees when we left the place. It could be sheer coincidence or otherwise, but I contracted a serious flu days after I returned from the chalet that lasted for a week. So in both stories, we have kids playing a fool and caught unaware when the entities hiding in the shadow were baiting to teach them a lesson. During our juvenile days, we all had our taste of creating trouble out of nothing. Just be glad it did not cause a long-lasting effect. Hope you have enjoyed these true ghost stories shared on Reddit. You would have realized a popular ghost story subgenre had not been featured in this episode. There were plenty of army ghost stories. Rest assured KK will curate and make a standalone episode solely on the scares our poor soldiers had experienced and left an indelible mark in their collective memory. If you have appreciated these stories I shared and want to hear more from our Lights Out crew, please like this video and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for our new content on weekly basis. Just remember, Singapore is a safe country, but does not mean that you are safe from the unseen. Good night, Lights Out family.